Seems like anytime anyone asks a question about faith, the questions just get harder. First, they want to know what you think about creationism, and then they want to know if you think there's really a virgin birth or if Jonah was really in the belly of a whale. Then they want to know, do you think that the translation of the Bible you're reading is actually the original language and fits most closely with that? The questions just keep getting harder. How is an ordinary Christian ever supposed to figure out all those answers? Well, today we've got Gavin Adams on our show, and he says that there's one answer that fits every question, and then it'll stop all of those arguments back and forth about who's right. I can't wait to find out what it is. It's what we're talking about right now. Welcome to Right Now. I'm Jennifer Shookman, and today we're doing something a little bit differently. Actually, for this whole month, we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of having our full panel of 4 guests, we're just having one person in. So, Gavin, it's really good to have you here with me.
I'm going to make up for 4 people.
You have to speak 4 times as much.
Okay, 4 times as fast.
But let me just, first of all, just sort of introduce you to those who maybe don't remember who you are.
Sure.
or haven't gotten to know you really well. You are a pastor at a church. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about your church.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm a pastor at Watermark Church. We're a campus location of North Point Ministries here in Atlanta. Our location is in Northwest Atlanta, a city called Woodstock. Probably not many people know where that is, but that's where we are at. And I've been doing that for now almost 7 years as a lead pastor there. So our church has grown a lot. We're excited about that, and getting ready to move into our first building, which is a really big deal for us. We're in a school right now. So for anybody who's doing portable church, man, I feel the pain of that. So, but we're pumped about that.
In fact, your church is growing so big that if this happens to run, depending on when this actually airs, and if it airs in repeats ever, it may not even be Watermark Church.
That's
you may
true.
have outgrown your name. Is that right?
That's true. We just announced we're changing the name of our church to Woodstock City Church, which we're pumped about because we want people to know, where we are, not just who we are. And so geographically, that's going to help. We want everybody to invite their friends to our church. And so, giving our church a name that at least overcomes where is it at, that's helpful for us. So we're changing that here soon.
Good. Well, you heard me at the top of the show say that it seems like the questions are getting harder. I know when I'm asked questions, whether it's just a random person on an airplane or whether it's a friend of mine who has serious questions, they just get harder. Like, I don't even know how to answer them anymore.
Yeah.
What are some of the hardest questions? You're a pastor, so I'm sure they're even harder for you. What are some of the hardest questions people ask you about Christianity?
What's funny is that growing up, I grew up in a church where we did like a Monday night visitation. I did that one time. It was awful. It was the worst experience of my life. But I got the point of it.
You or the people you visited?
Both. And I remember going to a home and knocking on a door, and they asked me a question about faith. And I was pretty young, and I remember kind of being petrified that they were going to ask, and then they asked. And it was such a terrible experience. And I probably stammered my way back to the car and just left. And I never did it again. Like, in fact, the rest of the night, we didn't go visit homes. We went to Waffle House because I was so nervous. I was so scared that they were going to ask me more questions. And so, growing up as a Christian, I've always had a fear, I think healthy fear, and also maybe unfounded, but mostly healthy, that people were going to ask hard questions. And I wasn't going to have an answer. And I felt like, and I know God's big and he's bigger than this, but when you're in the moment, you wonder, were people going to ask me a question that I couldn't answer and it was going to derail their faith or make it even harder for them to come to faith because I didn't have the answer.
Right.
And so then you look at the Bible, and it's the biggest book you've ever read, and you think, how can I possibly answer everyone's question? And then you begin to try to figure out the questions and the answers, and you realize it isn't even that clear.
Right. No,
Most of the questions don't even have clear answers. And so, becoming a pastor, that was one of my biggest fears, was how will I handle the questions, knowing people were going to ask. And so what you just asked, what are some of the hardest questions? People ask about creation, they ask about evolution. I have people who ask about, dinosaurs. They don't seem to talk about it in the Bible, yet we have these bones. What do we do with that, Right. To me, that's an easier answer. But for some people, that's a big deal. I think people struggle with some of the stories in the Bible. I'll tell you one that somebody asked me last week. They asked, how can I really believe in a God who seems to be behaving the way ISIS is behaving right now?
Wow.
You know,
wow.
that's a difficult question to deal with.
There are a lot of difficult questions, and I find sometimes it's the science, too, and I just
Yeah.
don't know that much about it. And then when people talk about the Old Testament versus the New Testament...
Discrepancies.
I think I know the Bible, but then all of a sudden I'm so confused. But you say there's one answer to every question that people have, and I can't wait to find out what that is. But you know what? You're going to have to come back after this break to find out what it is, and you'll want to know, believe me, you'll want to know what's the one answer that will answer all the questions you're asked. Welcome back. Today we're talking about all of those hard questions Christians are asked. Everything from how old is the earth to, the miracles. Do you really believe that they happened? Or why is the God of the Old Testament different than the God of the New Testament? And sometimes they're just so confusing and hard to answer. But Gavin, you are a pastor and you say you have the one answer that answers all of those questions. So I want to know, what is that answer?
The answer is I have no idea. No, I'm just kidding. That's not the answer. But
that's a good answer, though, right? Isn't it?
And it's actually probably true. I mean, let's be honest, right? When we pretend that we do know everything, we're probably lying to ourselves.
Yeah.
So that may be that's another show. But I think that there is an answer to this. And before I talk about the answer, let me quick caveat to that. I think it's important to understand that when people ask those questions, they're legitimate questions, and I think they're well-meaning questions. Yeah. I think people who are seeking those answers, we should lean into that. We should appreciate that they're asking those questions.
Well, we all had hard questions at some point, right?
And we probably all still do, if we're honest, right? If we're intellectually honest, we still do have some of those hard questions. So I think it's good they're asking. I think that engaging in the conversation is important. I also think that when I begin to think about the core of Christianity and what fits in that bucket, it's a pretty small bucket. It used to be really big for me. But the more that I've engaged in those conversations, the more I've engaged in the questions, and then honestly, the more I've grown in my relationship with Christ. The more I've realized that bucket of what really matters as far as answers go is getting smaller and smaller. So I think it's great to debate some of the miracles. I think it's great to debate Jonah and the whale, but I don't know that answering that absolutely scientifically is going to change eternity for people, okay?
So whether or not Jonah was really in the belly of a whale may not be as important as, for example,
that Jesus died on the cross and came back to life? Probably not as important, okay?
That's what you mean by a smaller bucket.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty much the core for me at this point, okay? But that doesn't mean we ignore the questions, and it doesn't mean we just kind of shut them and go, it doesn't matter, right? Okay. I do think there's an answer, but to get to the answer, let me set that up and talk about a story in the Bible that I think is just fascinating. So Jesus, he's with his disciples. They get in a boat. They go to the other side, is what we're told, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. There's a demon-possessed man, and he's out of his mind, okay? Now, I've never bumped into people like this on this level, okay?
I think I have.
This guy, I pray I don't. This guy is chained up, right, in the kind of the tombs, the catacombs area. I mean, he's naked. I mean, get him some khakis, right? He's naked. He every time he breaks free of the chains, which apparently he does all the time, he's beating everybody up. I mean, this guy is a handful to deal with. Everybody in the town knows about him. Everybody is scared of him. I mean, it's like, hide your women and children when he comes out. I mean, it's craziness. And so they go to the other side, and the guy breaks free, and he stops sprinting at Jesus. Now, we don't know. I'm guessing the disciples kind of bolt for their life. They jump back in the boat,
Which is what they normally did when trouble came up, right?
Yeah. They're in the belly of the boat, hiding, and Jesus is just, he's cool with it. He's Jesus. The guy runs up to him, and he pauses, and he says, "What do you want with me?" Now, short in the story, they have this beautiful conversation. Jesus actually, kind of purges him of the demons, right? They go into the pigs, they run into the sea. I mean, freaks everybody out. Kind of fun story. But he's healed. Now, he's still crazy to other people, and people don't know what to do with him. Now he's walking through the town completely normal, hopefully clothed, but completely normal. He asks Jesus if he could go with him and the disciples, and Jesus says, "No, you can't. You have to stay here." Now, this is so fascinating. A few weeks, I think, later, we don't know for sure, but a time later, we find out they go back to where he is, okay, to the other side, wherever that is. They go back to the Decapolis, is what they called it. It's a grouping of towns. This time, and this is so cool, well, let me back up. The first time he was there, they healed him. The pigs go into the ocean. Everybody dies, okay? The whole town...
The pigs die, not everybody dies.
The pigs die, okay? The whole town is like panicking because of what Jesus has done. They don't know what to do with it.
They're scared. Wouldn't you be scared if you saw a bunch of crazy pigs?
They don't know what to do with it. So they beg him to leave, and so he leaves.
Right.
The guy begs to go with him. He says, "No, you can't come. You can't go. Stay here." So then he comes back a few weeks later. Now, they just begged him to leave, and now he's back. You would think when he shows back up on the shore, there'd be a picketing line going, get out of here, we don't want you here, whatever.
Yeah.
Instead, when he shows back up, they all are welcoming him. They're all bringing their sick, they're bringing their lame, they're bringing their hurting. I mean, they're doing everything they can to engage with the person who a month ago they were begging to leave. So what's the difference? When you study it, here's what we find. The only difference I can find is that the guy who used to be crazy is now not. And instead of going with Jesus, he stayed in the towns. And for 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, he's been walking around. And my guess is that everywhere he went, people went, weren't you the guy who used to beat me up? Now you're completely normal. What happened?
Yeah, because he was infamous for how crazy
everybody
he was.
knew who he was, right? What happened? And every time he told that story, I think it began to change people's hearts. And I think that every time he told the story that I once was lost and now I'm different, I once was crazy, now I'm not, I once was insane, now my name is Joe, nice to meet you.
I once was naked, now I have khakis.
Right. What happened? And he's like, well, all I can tell you is what Jesus did. All I can tell you is what Jesus did. And so when he goes back and the reaction is so different, I have to believe, and I think I've watched this happen, I've seen it in my life. I think that we can argue about who Jesus was. I don't know that we can argue about what Jesus has done in our lives personally. And I think, to answer your question, I think that our story is our answer. As a Christian, I can't fully convince people, and I can't argue people into faith anyway. We shouldn't try to. I can't convince people what translation is best. I can't convince people, if it was 7 days of creation or 7,000 years. And I mean, those are great topics. They're great to talk about. I can't convince anybody which one's right. I can tell people my story. I can't, convince people that Jesus was actually the Son of God. That's a harder thing to convince. I can't convince people what he's done in my heart, because you can argue about who Jesus is, but it's really hard to argue against someone's story.
So this guy, what I'm hearing you say is that the people who heard his story didn't come up and go, well, what do you think about creationism? Or there's this guy named Jesus. Do you really believe he's the Messiah? It didn't matter.
No.
He's like, this is how I've changed.
I think they probably did. I mean, they probably did go up and go, so do you think he's a Messiah? And I bet that the former demon-possessed man said, I don't know, and I kind of don't care, because he healed me. I mean, look at my life now. I'm so different. And my story isn't as dramatic as his.
Well, and let me just stop you there. So even for that, it wasn't about eternal life for this guy. It was like making his here and now better.
That's right.
And so I'm guessing that this guy goes like, man, I don't even know about eternal life. I don't even know about all that stuff. But what I know is that this guy came into my life and made it better. And my life is better because of my interaction with him.
And here's the reality. I mean, we're talking about evangelism in a way, which means we're talking about people who are far from God. I think the people who are far from God, I think they have a concern about eternity. I think they think about that. That's more of an American culture thing, though, kind of a modern, thought process. I think they think about that. I think they're way more concerned, though, about how to make their marriage better right now than they are about what's going to happen when they die. I mean, I think they're concerned.
Sure.
But I think their primary concern is not that.
Yeah, so
nor was his.
Using your same thing, that if my marriage is in trouble, what I really want to do is hear from somebody else whose marriage was in trouble but somehow got through that.
Yes.
And if Jesus is a part of that, that gives me hope for my own marriage.
And it's hard to argue against that. It's hard to argue against that.
If my marriage is saved, or if I see someone else's dramatically changed, I frankly don't care what translation you read.
And it really doesn't matter, does it? And those are great conversations to have. But there is no great answer to those conversations. But the answer of, let me just share my story with you, I think that's why testimony is so important. And isn't it interesting how drawn we are to story, and how drawn we are to reconciliation, how drawn we are to people, being renewed? I mean, we love stories of forgiveness. I think that's part of God's thumbprint on our heart. And I think he put it there for a reason, because I think it may be the thing he leverages the most to draw people back to him. Because it's all relational anyway.
I think about some of the books that I've worked on, and I've done a couple of books with Jim Cymbal of the Brooklyn Tabernacle Church, and there's some incredible people who've had some incredible spiritual experiences. And some of them I saw on video or something before I got there, and I'm like, well, that's interesting, but I don't know if I believe it. But eventually I sat down in front of these people and interviewed them, and I was able to ask them any question I wanted. And though these were like really crazy, miraculous kinds of stories, once you sit down and you look someone in the eye and you ask them all the questions, it's hard not to believe that God was alive and working in their story.
It's certainly hard to look at someone and say, I don't believe your story.
I mean,
that people just aren't going to do that. Which I think for those of us that are believers, that really do have a heart for people who are far from God, I think the number one leverage point we have is not the gospel, the Bible, the books of the Bible, the stories, the authors. I mean, I think that's all in time good conversation. Our number one tool is what Jesus has done in our heart and in our life. And I'm a different person because of Jesus. I'm a different person because of what he's done in me. And so sharing that, allowing that to be kind of the starting point to answer all the questions has been phenomenally helpful. And so now, Jennifer, when people ask me all those hard questions, especially if they have a point behind it. I mean, if they're really seeking, I say it all the time. I say, listen, that's a great question. Can we back up and talk about something else first? And we'll get to that. Okay, we can talk about dinosaurs one day. We can talk about bellies of whales. We can talk about whatever. Discrepancies. We can get to that. But let me just talk to you about what Jesus has done. And if we can start with that as the foundation, not that all the other things don't matter, but they don't matter as much.
But once you sort of believe that core thing, it becomes easier to believe some of the peripheral things, if I could say that, I guess.
Well, and once Jesus has changed you, the thought, I mean, when you haven't been changed, the thought that somebody could live in a belly, I mean, I know we go to that one, but it's so absurd. Right? I mean, it's insane. It's crazy. So to think that that could actually happen, it's illogical. It's completely irrational. And so on the, coming into it outside of the faith, believing that, it is a little bit crazy. Once Jesus has changed you, that becomes a little bit more believable.
You can say, if he could do this in me, he could.
In fact, I know some people who have been changed so dramatically that living in the belly of a fish for 3 days is less dramatic than what happened to them.
Because of the life change that they've experienced.
Right. No. So I think that is the point. And it's just hard to argue your story. And it's hard for people to push back on what's actually happened to you. And I think that is ultimately the answer.
So actually, what you said first was right. So if somebody comes up and says, "I want to know what you think about creationism and how long is it new Earth, old Earth, or whatever," the first answer is, "I don't know." I don't know. But let me tell you.
Let me tell you what I do know.
Yeah. And for me, those core things would be: I know that God exists. I know that Jesus is a part of my life, or the Holy Spirit, or however you want to say that there is this presence in my life, and my life is different.
And my life tells me that I know that. Right. It's not an intellectual only thing. It's my life tells me that there's something more to that.
Someone once said that talking about God is like proving your innocence. Like all the facts are against you. You know, it would be like if like there's a commercial where the guy goes upstairs to help the woman whose faucet's leaking, but he has to take off his shirt and she's there in her lingerie, and her husband comes home and it looks horrible. It looks like he's been doing something he shouldn't, right? But in that situation, he knows he's innocent despite the fact that there's all this evidence against him, right? It's sort of that way with God. It's like proving your innocence. Like, I can't prove that I'm innocent when all of the evidence stacks against me. I can't prove that God exists, but in my heart, I know it, and you can't convince me of anything else.
You know what, too? I think God set it up that way on purpose. You know, if we had all the evidence we needed, we wouldn't need faith anymore.
Faith would be faith, it'd be proof, right?
Yeah, I mean, doubt is required for faith. I think we see those as opposites too much, and they're not opposites, they're actually best friends. They're required, and they're both required. And so if you knew every answer and you had evidence for everything, well, where would your faith really be? You wouldn't need faith anymore, because you would be able to rely on your evidence. I think there's something to that. But I think our story is what allows us to engage in the faith and engage others to consider the faith. I think all the other answers are good for conversation. In fact, I don't know that we're going to ever answer those. The people who scare me the most are the ones who pretend they have all the answers to those.
It's true.
Because they really don't.
It's true.
If we're to be honest, they really don't have all the answers. And so to allow that conversation around the questions, I think the reason we don't have all the answers, I think partially is because of faith and doubt. I think the other reason is when we engage in those conversations, our faith and relationship grows. And I think that's also why we don't have the answers. I think God wants us debating that stuff together, but I don't think God wants us leveraging it to keep people outside of the faith. I think he wants us to debate it and talk about it because it grows our faith. But I don't think that's something that everybody has to believe to come to faith.
You've mentioned a couple of times that this is for people who are far from faith, but I find a lot of my conversations are with people who are already believers in some respect.
Absolutely.
But they continue to have questions.
Or aren't sure they can be believers if they continue to have questions.
Exactly. What is your thought on that?
Well, I mean, think about John the Baptist. I mean, he's the guy, right? Outside of Jesus in this first century, I mean, he is the guy. I mean, when people prophesy about you thousands of years before you show up, you're a big deal. So he's in prison he's awaiting his death sentence, right? He's in prison for Herodias and all the crazy things that happened there, and he's speaking out against it. Okay, so he's in prison. He's about to be executed, and he has doubts.
Which is crazy, because if you think about it, like, Mary went to Elizabeth and he leapt in her womb, and so he's heard this story all of his life.
His whole life growing up.
He's dedicated his whole life to eating crickets and stuff and preaching that Jesus is coming. He's done this everything. Like he's done it all right. He's not Peter who messed up. He's done it all right. And now he's in prison and now he's going, wait.
Yeah, but the end is near, and he knows it. And so he's going, I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
So remember this, he sends his disciples, his followers, over to Jesus. And the guys ask Jesus, they go, hey, can you just give me some confirmation that you really are the Messiah? Because my guy back there, he just really wants to know.
Some questions.
He wants to know for sure. He's worried. And
because you know what? Part of the reason for that is because it didn't turn out like he'd planned.
Right.
He didn't plan on being in prison. Isn't that when we doubt our faith too? Is like somebody dies or something happens and it's not what we expected.
Or in John's case, I did exactly what I was called to do. And it's not working out the way I thought it was supposed to work out, and so it's not working out for him. Well, of course, Jesus says, hey, just go report back everything you've seen and everything you've heard. Like, he doesn't say yes. I mean, he says, go report back everything you've seen and you've heard.
So Jesus doesn't go, yeah, I'm the guy.
No, he doesn't.
He just goes, take a look around and make up your own mind.
Yeah, he basically says, embrace your doubt, but at the same time, have faith because of what's happened in your heart and what's happened in your life. So they go back and report. And basically, Jesus' answer is, the stories are the answer. Wow. Everything you're seeing around you and in you, the things that you've experienced, that is your answer. And it's like you are your own proof, and you're not going to find this, objective, unequivocal proof. It's not like, we're in the court of law. That's not.
And it's the stories of the other people, too.
Yeah,
it's not even your own. It's seeing these
miracles.
That's
why he said, look around you and report everything you've seen and you've heard. And they've seen and heard a lot.
Right.
They've seen and heard a lot. And so they're able to come back and they report that to John. And I think John goes, yeah, okay, I'm good.
Do you think Jesus was offended, though, that John, who was supposed to be his man, had all these questions?
You know what? I think we think that Jesus is going to be offended if we have questions. But when those guys go to Jesus turns to the entire crowd. Do you remember this? He turns to the entire crowd right after he gives them the answer. And he says, I tell you this, no one has ever been born of a woman greater than John the Baptist, who just asked that really offensive question.
Who should have known better, who spent his whole life doing this, who's got the story from when he was
Which makes me feel like if John can ask those kinds of questions, I think God's okay with me. Not to be too irreverent, but it's like, I think Jesus has his big boy pants on with me. And I think he can handle me asking hard questions. And I think he can handle me having doubt. And I think he can handle me not knowing all the answers. I think he's okay with that. In fact, not having the answers has probably driven me closer to Jesus than having them all.
Why?
Because it's the seeking of the answers that has drawn me closer
to him.
Because you're having to be drawn close to.
Yeah.
And so, I think about that with my kids. They don't have all the answers, but when they're willing to engage me in the conversation to learn about the answers, our relationship grows stronger, whether they ever get the answer or not. Because sometimes the answer is, you're never going to understand this, but the answer is because.
Right.
I'm your dad. That's the answer.
So.
But because we had a 30-minute conversation around the because I said so, our relationship is closer than had I said it in 30 seconds. I think it's the same thing.
And that's partly you want them to figure it out on their own, too. So you might tell them stories and say, now, how would you do this?
Absolutely.
And then how is that like your situation?
Absolutely.
And do that.
So
that's pretty interesting. So it's like we shouldn't be afraid of questions, and we shouldn't be afraid of somebody asking them of us or of our own, and we shouldn't be afraid of not having all the answers.
Right.
That's different than what happened to you when that first time you went out into that church.
So the homework, though, right, is to really think about your story.
Let's talk about that homework when we get back from this break. We're going to take a break right now. We're going to talk about the homework. How do you actually apply this? What happens when you're not afraid of questions and you're not afraid of not having the answers? Welcome back. We've been talking about what happens when you have questions or somebody brings questions to you and you don't have all the answers. And what you've said, Gavin, is that really the answer is our story. And it's something that people can't argue with. And oftentimes it's the most convincing because we're going through something similar, or we can see their changed life, which is such great proof, better than any sort of carbon dating might be or anything like that. But if our story is the answer, then practically, what do we do with that? How do we make that?
That's a good question.
You know, when somebody says, "Hey, what do you believe about creationism?"
Yeah. Your story is your answer is a great statement.
Right.
It's good for
But what do you
Twitter, but
do
what do you
with
do
it?
with it?
Yeah.
I think what we do is we proactively think about our story. You know, for me, this is what I learned to do. I decided if my story was going to be my answer, I needed to figure out how to tell my story. And so I just sat down and wrote my story. I sat down and started thinking through my faith story. What are the moments where Jesus has shown up? What are the moments when I felt like I was different than I used to be? What are the moments where God did something in me or did something through me that I could only give him credit for and couldn't explain it away outside of him? So now every time I'm engaged in those conversations, I'm completely comfortable saying, I don't know the answer to that. I'm completely comfortable saying that. But it doesn't end there. I don't know that. I don't know the answer. But can I tell you what Jesus has done in my heart? Can I tell you how my life is different today? We'll get back to the question later. Let me talk about that first, because it's the foundation of the answer.
So part of telling your story isn't just a salvation story.
No.
Like it was just this one moment of conversion. It's all of those moments of faith.
In fact, it may not even be a moment of conversion, because, I mean, you may have had a moment where you know that happened, or you may not have.
Right.
You may have fallen in love over the course of a life, of 4 years, or a year, or 4 months. And now you just know that you believe. And so I think it's even being okay just telling that part of your story.
Well, and what I can say, you've done a great job of that, even telling your personal story from the pulpit, if you will. You've talked about, marital things that have happened, and I know that's really helped other people. I don't know what your story is, but I hope you'll learn to tell it, because I really do believe it is the answer to all of those hard questions. Stay tuned for us next time. We'll bring back with more interesting ideas, more topics, and we'd love to hear from you online. Thanks for being a part of our show today.